Let's drift back in time to the year 1492. Imagine, if you can, the warm, dry air settling over the golden plains of Andalusia in southern Spain. For hundreds of years, this land had been a place of constant movement and conflict. For centuries, the echo of battles had rolled across the olive groves and bounced off the stone walls of ancient castles. It was a time when knights and warriors contested every river valley and every dusty hill. But now, a deep silence has finally fallen over the peninsula. The long era of the Reconquista has come to an end. The banners are still, and the war is finally over. But peace, as welcome as it is, brings a strange new atmosphere. Spain is full of men who've known nothing but the rhythm of the march. There are thousands of them wandering the streets. You can see knights with worn-out armor and nothing in their pockets. There are younger sons of noble families who've inherited a famous name but no land to call their own. And there are soldiers who've forgotten the gentle art of farming or tending to herds. They gather on the docks of Seville and Palos, staring out at the gray, rhythmic waves of the Atlantic Ocean. They're searching for something more. They're hungry for a new purpose. And that restless energy is a powerful thing. Where can these restless souls go? They can't head north because the borders of France are closed and fortified. They can't go east because the trade routes of the Mediterranean are locked tight. And so, their gaze turns west. They look toward the setting sun. They look into the vast, blue unknown. This is the story of what happened when that collective hunger was released onto a world they didn't even know existed. It's a story about the allure of gold and how it captivated the minds of men. It's a story of deep, green jungles that seem to go on forever. And it's a story of ancient civilizations that faded away into the mists of history. So, get comfortable now. Let your shoulders drop. Close your eyes. We're going to travel back to that pivotal moment when the old world first touched the new and everything changed. To really understand the people we call the conquistadors, you first have to understand the sheer emptiness of the ocean they faced. Before 1492, the Atlantic wasn't seen as a road or a highway. It was a wall. They called it the Sea of Darkness. Sailors whispered that if you sailed too far west, the winds would simply stop, or the water would become impassable, or mysteries from the deep would pull you down. But there was one man, a weaver's son from Genoa named Christopher Columbus, who looked at that endless blue wall and saw a door. He believed that by sailing into that void, he'd find a new path to the silk palaces of China and the aromatic spice markets of India. He didn't know that standing between him and Asia was a massive ancient landmass, home to millions of people who'd never seen a white sail on their horizon. Just imagine the sound of those wooden ships, the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, creaking and groaning in the quiet of the night. It's been 30 days without a sight of land. The crew is anxious. The water stretches endlessly in every direction, like a flat blue desert. At night, the stars look different, and the compass needle drifts in ways they don't understand. And then, there's a change. A scent arrives on the wind. It's not the sharp tang of salt anymore, but the smell of wet, rich earth. It's the scent of damp leaves and flowers blooming in the darkness. On October 12th, 1492, a lookout's voice breaks the silence with the word that would reshape history: tierra, land. When the Spaniards finally stepped onto the white sands of the Bahamas, they felt like they'd stumbled into a lost paradise. The air was heavy and sweet with tropical blooms. The water was turquoise and clear as glass, and the people of the islands came out to meet these strangers with a gentle curiosity. The Arawak natives offered them bright parrots, bundles of cotton, and fresh water. They didn't have iron tools. They didn't use gunpowder. They lived in a world that moved at a different pace, a world that hadn't known the wheel or the steel sword. Columbus wrote in his journals about their gentle nature. He noted that they didn't carry weapons and seemed peaceful, but in his mind, he was already calculating. He saw a land that could be claimed, and just like that, the dream of an untouched paradise began to fade. The era of the conquest had quietly begun. The news drifted back to Spain like a warm wind. Gold. It wasn't just a rumor or a sailor's tall tale. Columbus had brought back masks made of beaten gold. He had pearls from the coast. He told stories of riverbeds where gold dust sparkled in the sand. For the knights of Spain who'd been struggling in their cold stone castles, this sounded like salvation. They sold their cloaks and their furniture. They borrowed money they couldn't repay. They packed themselves onto leaking ships, enduring months of rough seas and limited rations, all for the chance to become kings in a new land. They landed on the island of Hispaniola, which we now know as Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And the atmosphere of the islands changed. It wasn't a settlement of farmers. It was an arrival of soldiers. They didn't come to till the soil. They came to claim it. They set up a system called the encomienda. It's a soft-sounding word that technically means protection. The idea was that a Spanish knight would look after a village and teach them his faith. In exchange, the locals would help him with his work. But in reality, it was a heavy burden that looked a lot like slavery. The local Arawak people were sent into the mines. They were pushed to dig for gold until they were exhausted, until their spirits broke. The lush islands, which had once echoed with the calls of tropical birds and the rhythm of the ocean, began to fill with the sounds of harsh orders and the barking of Spanish dogs. It was a tragic shift in the balance of life. When the Spaniards first arrived on Hispaniola, the island was teeming with people. But within 15 years, the population had plummeted. It wasn't just the hard labor or the conflict. The biggest tragedy was silent and invisible. It was illness. The locals had no natural defense against the diseases the newcomers carried. A simple cold or a cough could devastate a village in days. The silence of the islands grew deeper and sadder, and to make matters worse, the gold was running out. The streams of Hispaniola were being tapped dry. The conquistadors stood on the shores of their fading paradise, looking west once again. They heard rumors of something bigger, not just islands, not just villages, but entire cities. They heard whispers of a great empire on the mainland, a place where silver covered the walls and kings washed in gold. The legend of El Dorado was beginning to take root. Among the restless men waiting in the Caribbean was a young notary named Hernán Cortés. He wasn't famous yet. He was a minor noble from a dry, dusty town in Spain called Medellín. He'd studied a bit of law, but he found he couldn't sit still behind a desk. He was 25, sharp, ambitious, and very charming. He'd spent his time in Cuba gambling and dreaming of something more than a quiet life. In 1519, whispers reached him about a massive landmass to the west. The governor of Cuba, a cautious man named Velázquez, asked Cortés to lead a small group to check out the coast. The orders were clear. Just look. Don't land, don't start a fight. Just see what's there. But Cortés wasn't the type to just look. He mortgaged everything he had. He bought ships and supplies. He recruited 500 men who were just as desperate for adventure as he was. He loaded horses onto the ships, animals that the people of the mainland had never seen, animals that would seem almost mythical to them. The governor tried to call him back at the last second, sensing that Cortés was going to disobey. But it was too late. In the quiet of the night, Cortés raised his sails. He left Cuba as a rebel. There was no going back now. Imagine the moment his fleet sailed up to the coast of Mexico. The humidity hits you first, a wall of tropical heat. The jungle is a dense, tangled green curtain that stretches as far as you can see, and then, rising out of the trees, they spot stone towers. These aren't simple huts. They're complex structures. They land on the beaches of Veracruz. The local people, the Totonacs, come out to greet them. These people are different from the islanders. They wear woven cotton. They have gold ornaments. And they seem afraid. They tell Cortés about the rulers of this land. They speak of a people who live high in the mountains, a people who demand tribute and hold immense power. They call them the Aztecs. Cortés listens intently. He smiles. He realizes this isn't just a tribe, it's an empire. And every empire has rivals. Then, Cortés does something that has become legendary. His men are nervous. They see the endless jungle. They hear the distant drums. They want to go back to the safety of Cuba. So, Cortés gathers them on the beach. He points to the harbor where their 11 ships are anchored, their only ride home. He gives the order to burn them. The torches are thrown. The wood catches fire. The flames roar up into the tropical sky, sending black smoke drifting over the water. The men watch in silence as their retreat turns to ash. Cortés turns to them. "Now," he says, "we go to Mexico City." The march inland was like stepping into a fantasy. The Spaniards climbed from the steaming jungles up into the cool, thin air of the mountains. They passed active volcanoes that smoked against the deep blue sky. They had skirmishes with the Tlaxcalans, a fierce group who had no love for the Aztecs. Cortés, using his charm and his lawyer's mind, convinced them to join forces. He wasn't just walking with 500 Spaniards anymore. He was marching with thousands of native warriors who saw these strangers as a chance to change their world. And then, in November of 1519, they reached the final mountain pass. They stopped and looked down. Below them lay the Valley of Mexico, and in the center of a vast, shimmering lake sat the city of Tenochtitlan. It looked impossible. It was a city floating on water. It was bigger than London or Paris. Wide causeways connected it to the shore. Great white pyramids rose toward the sun, their walls gleaming so brightly they almost hurt your eyes. Canals ran through the city like Venice, filled with canoes carrying flowers and food. One soldier wrote that they were amazed, saying it was like the enchantments told in old legends. He wondered if what they were seeing was even real, or just a dream. But if it was a dream, it was a heavy, intense one. As they crossed the causeway into the city, the atmosphere shifted. They saw the temples where the priests performed their rituals to the sun god. The Aztec emperor, Montezuma II, came out to meet them. He was carried on a litter draped in gold and feathers. He thought that perhaps Cortés was the god Quetzalcoatl returning from the east. The meeting was thick with tension. The smell of incense mixed with the metallic scent of Spanish armor. Montezuma offered gifts of gold chains and beautiful feathers. He welcomed them into his palace. For 6 months, the Spaniards lived in the heart of the Aztec capital as guests. But they felt like they were in a gilded cage. They walked the markets, marveling at the chocolate and the jade, but they slept in their armor. They kept their hands near their swords. They knew they were a tiny island in a sea of millions. Cortés knew this peace was fragile, so he made a bold, dangerous move. He took Emperor Montezuma hostage in his own palace. He tried to rule the empire through the captive king, asking for more and more gold. The people obeyed, terrified for their leader. But the tension was like a wire being pulled tighter and tighter. It had to snap. It happened when Cortés had to leave the city for a short time. He left his lieutenant, a man named Alvarado, in charge. Alvarado was brave, but impulsive. During a sacred festival, while the nobility was dancing in the square, Alvarado panicked. He thought they were attacking. He ordered the gates closed, and a tragedy unfolded. The conflict was brutal. By the time it was over, the trust was shattered. When Cortés returned, the city was eerily silent, but it was the silence of a storm about to break. The bridges were razed. The markets were empty. The city had turned against them. The date is June 30th, 1520. History remembers it as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. The city of Tenochtitlan has become a trap. The causeways are cut. Food is scarce. The Spanish garrison is holed up in the palace, listening to the drums of war beating outside. It's a low, rhythmic thumping that never stops, day or night. It's the heartbeat of a city that wants them gone. Cortés knows they can't stay. If they do, they'll be overwhelmed. He comes up with a desperate plan to break out under the cover of darkness. It's a rainy night. A heavy tropical mist falls over the lake, hiding the moon. The soldiers wrap their horses' hooves in cloth to muffle the sound. They build a portable wooden bridge to cross the gaps in the causeway. But before they leave, they look at the gold. Piles of it are on the floor. Bars of bullion, chains, ornaments. Cortés takes a share for the king, loading it onto the strongest horses. But there's so much left. He tells his soldiers to take what they want, but he warns them, travel light if you want to travel far. But the allure of wealth is heavy. The veteran soldiers take only a few small gems, but the new recruits can't resist. They stuff their pockets. They fill their helmets. They wrap gold chains around their waists until they can barely move. They're weighed down by their own dreams. At midnight, the gates open. The column moves silently into the rain. They reach the first gap and lay down their bridge. They cross safely. But when they try to lift the bridge to move it to the next gap, it's stuck. The weight of the horses and the mud has locked it in place. It won't budge. And then a shout rings out. A woman fetching water sees them. She cries out that they are escaping. The lake explodes with noise. Hundreds of canoes emerge from the mist. Arrows fall like rain. The escape turns into a chaotic scramble. The horses slip on the wet stone. They reach the second gap, a wide channel of dark water, and there is no bridge. They have to swim. And this is where the gold claims its price. The soldiers who had stuffed their pockets, the men who had wrapped heavy chains around their bodies, jump into the water and sink. They don't come back up. They're pulled down into the mud of the lake by the very treasure they tried to take. Cortés survives. He makes it to the mainland and sits under a great cypress tree, watching the survivors stagger out of the mist. He's lost 2/3 of his men. He's lost the artillery. He's lost the gold. And legend says he wept. But Cortés doesn't give up. He retreats to the lands of his allies to heal and wait. And while he waits, a silent weapon is working for him inside the city, something he didn't even know he had brought. While the Spaniards rested in the mountains, a strange silence fell over Tenochtitlan. The drums stopped. The markets closed. A disease had arrived with the ships, smallpox. To the Europeans, it was a known illness, unpleasant, but survivable. But here, it was devastating. It swept through the crowded city like a wildfire. There was no one left to grind the corn or bring fresh water. People were too weak to move. The emperor, who had driven Cortés out, fell ill and passed away. When Cortés returned a year later in 1521, the mighty empire he had seen was gone. He faced a weakened city. This time, the siege was absolute. He built ships to control the lake. He cut the water supply. The siege lasted for months. The new emperor, Cuauhtémoc, fought for every inch of stone, but the end was inevitable. While the Spaniards rested in the mountains, a strange silence fell over Tenochtitlan. The drums stopped, the markets closed. A disease had arrived with the ships, smallpox. To the Europeans, it was a known illness, unpleasant, but survivable. But here, it was devastating. It swept through the crowded city like a wildfire. There was no one left to grind the corn or bring fresh water. People were too weak to move. The emperor, who had driven Cortés out, fell ill and passed away. When Cortés returned a year later in 1521, the mighty empire he had seen was gone. He faced a weakened city. This time, the siege was absolute. He built ships to control the lake. He cut the water supply. The siege lasted for months. The new emperor, Cuauhtémoc, fought for every inch of stone, but the end was inevitable. People whispered about a place where they drank from golden cups and built stone walls so perfect that a knife blade couldn't fit between the blocks. They spoke of strange camels without humps that carried silver. Pizarro wanted to find this land, but he had no funding. He had to scrape together money for 2 failed expeditions. His men starved in the swamps of Colombia. In 1527, on a lonely island, his expedition fell apart. His men were sick and wanted to go home. Pizarro drew a line in the sand with his sword. He pointed north to Panama and safety, but poverty. Then he pointed south, toward the unknown and potential riches. He told them to choose. Only 13 men crossed the line to stand with him. They waited on that island for months, the seed of a new conquest. What Pizarro didn't know was that the empire he was looking for was already fracturing. The Inca Empire, which stretched along the spine of the Andes Mountains, was a marvel. It was a vertical world. While others lived on plains, the Incas lived in the clouds. They built thousands of miles of paved roads that scaled cliffs and crossed deep gorges on bridges made of woven grass. They had a complex system to track every potato and piece of wool using knotted strings called quipus. But the disease from the north had traveled faster than the men. Smallpox had arrived in the Andes before Pizarro did. It took the life of the Inca ruler and his heir, leaving the throne empty. 2 brothers, Atahualpa and Huáscar, claimed it. They plunged the empire into a bitter civil war. Cities were burned and the roads were lined with the fallen. Atahualpa won the war. He captured his brother and was resting at a hot springs resort called Cajamarca, surrounded by 80,000 experienced troops. He was celebrating, feeling untouchable. And that's when the messengers arrived. Runners sprinting along the mountain roads brought news of strangers on the coast, men with facial hair, men with metal pots on their heads, men riding giant beasts. There were only 168 of them. Atahualpa laughed. He had legions of warriors. He decided to let them come to him. He was curious. He wanted to see these strange visitors. He made the mistake of thinking they were just travelers. He didn't realize they marked the end of his world. Pizarro and his small band began the long climb. They left the dry, brown coast of Peru and headed up. As you climb the Andes, the air changes. It becomes thin and cold. It burns your lungs. The Spaniards led their horses along narrow paths cut into sheer rock faces. One slip meant falling thousands of feet into the mist. They crossed those swaying grass bridges, terrified the fibers would snap under their heavy iron armor. They knew they were walking into a trap. Every night they slept in their armor. They saw signal fires burning on the peaks above. But the attack never came. Atahualpa had ordered his people to let them pass. On November 15th, 1532, Pizarro's exhausted men crested the final ridge. Below them lay the valley of Cajamarca. It was beautiful. Green fields, stone buildings, and steam rising from the hot springs. And covering the hillsides were the tents of the Inca army. At night, their campfires looked like the stars had fallen to earth. The Spanish soldiers stopped and fell silent. Fear took hold of them. There were less than 200 of them, and 80,000 warriors down there. Pizarro rode to the front. He looked at the fires, then at his men. There was no going back. The only way out was through. They rode down into the deserted town of Cajamarca. Atahualpa had cleared it for them. It was a guest house, or maybe a cage. That night, the Spaniards didn't sleep. They prayed. They sharpened their swords. Pizarro came up with a plan that seemed impossible. He wouldn't fight the army. He would try to capture the emperor himself. The sun rose over the Andes on a crisp Saturday morning. The Spaniards were hiding inside the stone buildings around the main square. Their cannons were loaded. The men with muskets had their fuses lit. The cavalry calmed their nervous horses. Pizarro waited. The hours ticked by slowly. The sun climbed higher. Finally, around noon, the Inca procession began. It was like a river of color flowing toward the town. Sweepers came first to clear the road, then dancers and musicians, then thousands of nobles in checkered tunics and gold plates, and in the center, on a massive litter lined with parrot feathers, sat Atahualpa. He looked confident. He had brought only a few thousand attendants into the square, and they were mostly unarmed. He couldn't imagine these dirty, bearded strangers would dare to touch him. The rest of his massive army stayed outside the walls. The procession filled the square, and Atahualpa stopped. He looked around. "Where are they?" he asked. A friar walked out with a Bible and a cross. He spoke to the emperor about God and the King of Spain. He demanded submission. Atahualpa was confused. He'd never seen a book before. In his world, knowledge was spoken or tied in knots. He held the book to his ear, expecting it to speak. When it didn't, he threw it into the dust in frustration. The friar shouted back to the hidden soldiers. Pizarro waved a white scarf, and then the silence shattered. The cannons roared. The muskets fired. The Spanish war cry went up. The cavalry charged out of the buildings. The Incas had never seen horses before. To them, it looked like a monster. Man and beast fused together, moving at supernatural speed. Panic set in. The square was walled and they were trapped. The conflict was one-sided. The nobles rushed to protect their emperor, using their bodies as shields. But they had no weapons. They fell one by one, trying to keep the litter aloft. Pizarro fought his way through the crowd and grabbed Atahualpa, dragging him down. "Do not kill him!" Pizarro shouted. "I want him alive!" As the emperor hit the ground, the resistance crumbled. The survivors fled, breaking down a wall in their desperation. In a couple of hours, it was over. The sun set over the valley, and the son of the sun was a prisoner. The empire had been decapitated in a single afternoon. Atahualpa was a prisoner, but he was clever. He watched his captors. He saw the way they looked at gold. He made Pizarro an offer. Standing in a stone room, he reached up and drew a red line on the wall. "I will fill this room with gold up to this line," he said, "and the next room twice over with silver, in exchange for my freedom." Pizarro was stunned, but he agreed. A notary recorded the contract. The word went out, and from every corner of the empire, llama caravans began to arrive. They brought golden jars, plates, and life-sized statues. The room filled slowly, but promises were broken. Pizarro had the gold, but he was afraid. Rumors swirled of an Inca rescue army. His partners were nervous. They argued that as long as Atahualpa lived, he was a symbol. So on July 26, 1533, a trial was held. It was a farce. Atahualpa was accused of idolatry and rebellion. He was sentenced to be burned, which horrified him, as his religion required his body to be whole for the afterlife. He agreed to convert to Christianity to save his soul from the flames. That evening, as the sun dipped below the peaks, the last Sapa Inca was strangled in the square. The balance of the world shifted forever. With the emperor gone, the road to Cusco was open. The Spaniards marched south to the capital. Many tribes who had been conquered by the Incas years before saw the Spanish as liberators and joined them. On November 15th, Pizarro entered Cusco. It was a city of stone, a masterpiece. The walls were made of massive granite blocks cut so perfectly they fit together without mortar, able to withstand earthquakes. The Spaniards rode into the main square and saw the Temple of the Sun. The gardens were filled with golden corn stalks and silver leaves. It was a glittering fantasy made real. Pizarro installed a puppet emperor named Manco Inca to keep order, and the Spaniards began to settle in, taking palaces as homes. But Manco Inca was no puppet. He watched the greed and the mistreatment. In 1536, he asked to leave the city for a ceremony and never returned. Instead, the hills around Cusco came alive with movement. It wasn't the wind. It was an army of 100,000 warriors. They set the thatched roofs on fire with red-hot stones, and the siege of Cusco began. The siege lasted for 10 brutal months. The Spaniards were trapped in a burning city, fighting desperately in the narrow streets. But eventually, reinforcements arrived, and Manco retreated into the deep jungle to a hidden city called Vilcabamba, where the Inca spirit lived on in the shadows. But the real threat to Pizarro wasn't the Incas anymore. It was his own people. Greed is a poison, and there wasn't enough gold to satisfy 2 ambitious men. Pizarro and his partner, Almagro, had been friends once, but now they were enemies. Almagro felt cheated. Civil war broke out between the factions. Pizarro's brothers defeated Almagro and executed him. But Almagro had a son, and a son never forgets. In June 1541, an old Pizarro was dining in his palace in Lima. A group of 20 men burst in, shouting, "Death to the tyrant!" Pizarro fought back, but he was outnumbered. A sword thrust caught him in the throat. The conqueror of Peru fell on the floor of his own palace, bleeding out. With his last strength, he drew a cross in his own blood and kissed it before he died. The man who had lived by the sword died by it. But the machine didn't stop with Pizarro. The hunger for gold had mutated. Rumors drifted out of the Colombian Andes about a king so wealthy he covered himself in gold dust every morning. They called him El Dorado, the Golden Man. In 1538, an expedition led by Gonzalo Jimenez de Quesada set out to find him. They hacked through thick vines and dragged horses through swamps where the mud swallowed them whole. They died of fever and snake bites, but they kept going. Finally, they found the Muisca people and a sacred lake called Guatavita. The Muisca told them that yes, their king would cover himself in gold dust and dive into the center of the lake as an offering. For centuries they had thrown emeralds and gold into the depths. The Spaniards saw a bank vault, not a holy site. They tried to drain the lake with buckets and spades. They found a few trinkets in the mud, but the center remained deep and unreachable. The mud hardened like concrete in the sun. Quesada founded Bogota, but he never found the vast hoard he dreamed of. El Dorado wasn't a city. It was a ritual, but the legend wouldn't die. For 200 years, men would wander into the green hell of the Amazon chasing a city of gold that existed only in their imaginations. The search for El Dorado drove men to madness, but it also forced them to map the continent. In 1541, Another expedition set out from Quito, looking for the land of cinnamon. It was led by Pizarro's brother, Gonzalo, and a knight named Orellana. The rainforest swallowed them. Their food ran out. They ate their dogs and boiled their leather saddles to soften them. Desperate, Orellana took a small boat and 50 men to scout downriver. The current grabbed them and swept them away. They drifted for months. They saw trees so tall they blocked out the sun. They fought tribes on the riverbanks. Orellana wrote of warrior women and named the river after the Amazons of Greek myth. Finally, after drifting 4,000 miles, they tasted salt. They had crossed the entire continent from the Andes to the Atlantic. They had discovered the largest river system on Earth. They found no gold, but they found a wilderness so vast it made them feel small. While Orellana drifted east, another famous conquistador, Hernando de Soto, marched north. He was wealthy from Peru, but he wanted his own empire. In 1539, he landed in Florida with 600 men. He marched through Georgia, the Carolinas, and Alabama, looking for cities of gold. He found only cornfields and fierce warriors in the swamps. In May 1541, he emerged from the trees and saw a river of immense width, churning with brown mud. He was the first European to see the Mississippi. He crossed it, pushing into Arkansas, still chasing rumors. But his men were dying, and De Soto himself fell ill with fever. On the banks of the great river, De Soto died. His men were terrified. They had told the natives he was a god who couldn't die. So, in the dead of night, they wrapped his body in blankets weighed down with sand. They rowed to the middle of the Mississippi and quietly pushed him over the side. The dark water took him. He had come for gold and found a muddy grave. But he left something behind. His horses escaped into the woods. They survived and bred, spreading across the Great Plains. These Spanish horses became the Mustangs. 2 centuries later, the Comanche and the Sioux would find them and transform into the great horse cultures of the American West. By the mid-16th century, the era of great conquests was fading. Spain claimed the Americas, and the galleons began to return to Seville. They were heavy, slow ships carrying gold and silver that would change the world. Spain imported tons of treasure, but history has a sense of irony. It was the curse of Midas. You can't eat gold. The flood of treasure caused prices to skyrocket. A peasant could starve with a silver coin in his pocket because bread was too expensive. Instead of building their economy, Spanish kings spent the gold on endless wars. The wealth flowed into Spain and right back out to pay for soldiers and ships. Spain became a hollow empire. Meanwhile, the printing presses of Europe churned out stories of Spanish cruelty, painting them as monsters rather than heroes. By the 17th century, the empire was bankrupt. The Armada was sunk. The gold was gone. The glory had turned to rust. Let's step back now. Let the dust settle. The conquistadors were men of their time, brave, resilient, and driven. They walked across unknown continents in heavy iron, but they were also destructive. They wiped out ancient cultures and melted down art for coins. And what remains of them? Pizarro lies in a glass box in Lima, a tourist attraction. Cortés is buried in a quiet church in Mexico City, almost forgotten. De Soto is part of the river mud. But go to the Andes today. The Spanish palaces are crumbling, but beneath them the Inca stones are still standing strong. Go to the jungles of Guatemala. The Spanish roads are gone, eaten by vines, but the Mayan pyramids still point to the stars. Empires rise and fall like the tides. The conquistadors thought they were conquering for eternity, but in the end, they were just another storm passing through the valley. The gold is gone, and the silence has returned.